This is based on official documentation that surfaced less than 12 hours ago, and what these documents reveal about Meghan Markle has already triggered an emergency response from Buckingham Palace.
In the pale silence of a winter dawn, a quiet property transfer rippled through palace corridors like thunder beneath marble floors. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle had just secured a private estate, once held close to the Queen's personal world. Within hours, outrage inside the royal family began to simmer. The morning the palace phones began ringing. The first call came just after 6 in the morning, when the London sky was still a muted shade of gray, and the palace grounds sat wrapped in that peculiar winter silence known only to the earliest staff. At Buckingham Palace, the administrative offices were just beginning to stir. Lights flickered on in quiet corridors. Security teams rotated shifts. The first trays of tea were being carried through service hallways that had not yet seen the rush of the day. But inside a small legal office tucked behind the palace's eastern wing, one routine check of the property registry had just triggered a chain reaction that no one had expected. The name attached to the record was unmistakable: Prince Harry, and beside it, listed as co-owner, Meghan Markle. The document itself was simple enough: a finalized acquisition, a countryside estate, private sale, completed several weeks earlier. But the address attached to that record made the situation something else entirely. Because the property in question was not simply another country house. It was a quiet estate, long associated with Queen Elizabeth's personal holdings, a place rarely discussed publicly, yet deeply familiar to those who had served within the royal household for decades. For a moment, the junior legal officer reviewing the document simply stared at the screen. Then she picked up the phone. The first call went to a senior property advisor inside the palace estate office. Within minutes, that advisor was standing beside her desk, reading the same document with the same slow disbelief. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Finally, the advisor muttered the words that would soon echo through 3 royal residences before breakfast. "This cannot be correct." But the paperwork was unmistakably real. The purchase had already been finalized, and somehow, the palace had not known. Within 10 minutes, the second round of calls began. One line connected to Clarence House, where advisors working for King Charles were beginning their morning briefings. Another call went directly to Kensington Palace, where Prince William's staff had just arrived to prepare the day's schedule. At first, the conversations were cautious, administrative, quiet. But as more officials opened the file and confirmed the details, the tone began to shift, because the property's name carried weight. Not political weight, not financial weight, something more complicated than that: memory. For years, the estate had existed almost like a private footnote inside the Queen's personal world. It was never featured in official royal tours, rarely mentioned in media briefings. And yet, among palace staff, it was well known as one of the late monarch's most cherished places of retreat. It was the sort of property that existed outside public life, a refuge, which is why the question now echoing through palace offices felt so unsettling. How was it sold? And more importantly, how had Prince Harry and Meghan Markle managed to buy it? By 6:45, the information had reached Clarence House. The first reaction there was not anger. It was confusion. King Charles's advisors had assumed the estate remained protected within the broader structure of royal property oversight. Even if the land technically existed outside Crown Estate holdings, there had always been an understanding that certain locations carried symbolic importance beyond their legal status. Places tied to the Queen's personal life were rarely treated like ordinary real estate. They were preserved, guarded quietly. But the documents now circulating across email screens suggested something else entirely. The estate had entered the private market months earlier, and the Sussex household had moved quickly, very quickly. By 7:15, the phones inside Kensington Palace were ringing. Prince William's private secretary was the first to receive the briefing. The explanation unfolded in slow, careful sentences as the palace property advisor relayed what little they understood. There had been a listing, a discreet one, handled through a private brokerage firm specializing in historic estates. The sale had been conducted quietly, without public announcement, and at some point during that process, Harry and Meghan's representatives had stepped in. They had secured the property before the palace had even realized it was available. When the call ended, William's secretary sat silently at his desk for several seconds. Then he walked down the corridor toward the Prince of Wales's office. Inside, William had just begun reviewing his morning schedule. There were meetings planned, charity updates, a briefing on environmental initiatives scheduled for later that afternoon. Ordinary work, routine. The secretary knocked once before entering. He placed a thin folder on the desk. "There's something you need to see." William opened the file. At first, his expression remained calm, focused, but as he read the property documents, the atmosphere in the room shifted almost imperceptibly. Because William knew that estate, he had visited it as a child. He remembered the long, quiet drive through the trees, the stillness of the grounds, the way the Queen had seemed unusually relaxed whenever she spent time there. It was never discussed publicly, but within the family, everyone understood what the place meant, and now the ownership line at the bottom of the document carried two names that William had not expected to see attached to it: Prince Harry, Meghan Markle. For several seconds, William said nothing. Then he leaned back in his chair, staring at the document, as if trying to understand how the situation had reached this point. Outside his office, the morning sun had begun to rise over Kensington Gardens. Inside palace offices across London, however, a different kind of daylight was spreading. Phones were ringing. Advisors were whispering, and the quiet estate that once belonged to the Queen had just become the center of a storm the royal family had not seen coming. The estate the Queen guarded quietly. To understand why the news of the estate's sale unsettled the palace so deeply, one first had to understand the place itself. It was never the largest royal property. It was not one of the grand historic residences known to the public. No ceremonial photographs had ever been taken there. No diplomatic receptions had ever unfolded in its drawing rooms. Its name rarely appeared in official briefings, and for decades, it existed almost like a quiet secret inside the vast geography of royal land. Yet among the Queen's inner household, the estate carried a significance that could not be measured by acreage or architecture. It was personal. Tucked within a secluded stretch of countryside several hours from London, the property sat behind long corridors of woodland and low stone walls that had not changed for generations. The approach road curved gently through fields, where the noise of the modern world seemed to fade with every mile. By the time visitors reached the gates, the outside world felt distant, almost irrelevant. Queen Elizabeth had first developed a quiet attachment to the estate decades earlier, long before the pressures of modern media and constant public scrutiny intensified around the monarchy. The property had originally been acquired through a private arrangement connected to the broader royal family holdings, but it had never been treated as an official residence. Instead, it became something else entirely: a retreat. Unlike Balmoral, which carried its own long traditions of royal gatherings, or Sandringham, which operated with a rhythm of seasonal events and staff rotations, this estate remained deliberately understated. Only a small team of caretakers maintained the grounds. Visits were rarely scheduled far in advance. Sometimes even senior palace aides would learn of the Queen's arrival only hours before she appeared. Those who worked closely with her over the years began to notice a subtle change whenever she spent time there. The pace slowed. The rigid structure of royal duty softened, if only slightly. Without the constant choreography of public appearances, the Queen moved through the estate with a kind of quiet ease that staff rarely saw elsewhere. She would walk the grounds without ceremony, sometimes accompanied only by a single protection officer trailing discreetly at a distance. Conversations with staff became more relaxed, more reflective. There were afternoons when the monarch could simply sit beside the windows overlooking the fields, reading correspondence, or speaking quietly with those closest to her. It was not an escape from responsibility, but it was perhaps the closest thing she allowed herself. Within the family, the estate carried a similar quiet understanding. Not every royal had visited it frequently, yet those who had understood that the place belonged to a different emotional register within the Queen's life. It was not designed for spectacle or legacy or institutional symbolism. It was designed for peace. Over the years, the property also became associated with moments when the Queen sought reflection during difficult periods. Staff members who had served during turbulent chapters of royal history, the public upheavals of the 1990s, the strains of family crises, the constant pressure of public scrutiny, remembered that the estate sometimes became a temporary refuge during those storms. There were no official statements when she traveled there, no press announcements, just a quiet departure and a quiet return. Because of that deeply personal connection, the estate gradually acquired a kind of unwritten protection within palace thinking. Even though it did not formally belong to the Crown estate system, most advisors assumed that any future changes involving the property would be handled carefully, privately, and with the full awareness of senior members of the royal family. It was never viewed as a commodity. It was viewed as a memory. After the Queen's passing, that sense of quiet reverence became even stronger. Staff who had worked at the property spoke about it almost with a kind of custodial responsibility. The estate, they believed, represented a piece of the late monarch's personal landscape that should remain untouched by the shifting politics and practicalities of royal administration. There had been informal discussions about how the property might be preserved. Some advisors quietly believed it should remain under discreet family stewardship. Others suggested it could be maintained through a private trust connected to the royal household. But what everyone assumed was simple: the estate would remain within the orbit of the monarchy. That assumption was never formally written down. It did not appear in legal documents or official charters. Yet, inside palace culture, unwritten rules often carried just as much weight as formal law. And this was one of those rules, which is why the discovery that the estate had quietly entered the private market months earlier struck palace staff like a sudden fracture in that quiet understanding. Someone had allowed the property to be listed, someone had approved its sale, and now, somehow, it belonged to Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. The legal reality of the situation was difficult to challenge. The estate had never been fully absorbed into Crown estate structures, meaning its ownership pathway allowed for private transfer under certain circumstances. But legality and symbolism were not the same thing inside the royal world. Certain places carried meaning that could not be measured through contracts. Certain properties held emotional history that no legal clause could fully capture. For many within the palace, the estate represented one of those rare spaces. And now that space had crossed an invisible line. It no longer belonged quietly within the Queen's private world. It had become part of the story surrounding Harry and Meghan, a story that, in recent years, had already strained the fragile threads connecting the Sussex household to the rest of the royal family. Which raised the question that advisors across 3 royal residences were now asking in hushed voices. Did Harry understand what this place had meant to his grandmother? Or had the estate simply appeared to him as another beautiful piece of land waiting to be claimed? Because if the latter was true, the consequences of that misunderstanding were already beginning to ripple through palace corridors. And the morning was only just beginning. The deal that nobody saw coming. By the time palace officials began examining the paperwork more closely, one fact quickly became clear. This had not been a sudden decision. The acquisition of the Queen's former private estate had unfolded quietly over several months, moving through channels that few inside the royal household had been watching closely. And that, perhaps, was the most unsettling discovery of all. Because in the world surrounding royal properties, transactions rarely happen without layers of consultation. Even when estates technically exist outside the Crown estate structure, there are usually signals, small indications that something is changing. A notice passed quietly between advisors. A conversation with property managers, a discreet warning that land might soon enter the private market. But in this case, none of those signals had reached the palace in time. Instead, the transaction appeared to have moved through a much narrower corridor of information. According to the property documents now circulating among royal administrators, the estate had been listed through a private brokerage firm specializing in historic country properties. These firms operate very differently from the public real estate market. Listings are rarely advertised widely. Potential buyers are screened carefully. Negotiations often take place entirely out of public view. It was a system designed for discretion, and discretion in this instance had worked perfectly. The estate entered the market quietly sometime in the autumn of the previous year. The listing was circulated only among a small circle of high net worth buyers known to the brokerage. For several weeks, there was little visible movement, but sometime in late November, according to the timeline reconstructed by palace advisors, interest began to emerge from an unexpected direction. Representatives connected to Prince Harry and Meghan Markle had made contact with the brokerage. At first, the inquiry appeared routine. The Sussex household had been exploring property investments for some time, particularly estates that offered privacy and historical character. In the circles of luxury real estate, such inquiries were hardly unusual. But once Harry and Meghan's representatives learned the identity of the estate, the pace of negotiations changed dramatically. Within days, meetings were arranged, lawyers became involved, financial terms were quietly outlined. And according to individuals familiar with the process, the couple's representatives moved quickly to secure an agreement before the property could attract wider attention. The deal itself remained tightly contained. No public announcement was made, no press coverage appeared. The sale was structured through private legal channels designed specifically to protect the confidentiality of both buyer and seller. For the brokerage firm handling the transaction, the arrangement likely appeared ideal. A prestigious historic estate had found buyers who valued privacy and discretion. The negotiations moved smoothly. The paperwork progressed without complication. But outside that narrow circle of participants, the implications of the sale remained invisible. Inside Buckingham Palace, no alarm bells rang. Inside Clarence House, no briefing documents appeared. Inside Kensington Palace, no advisors suspected that one of the Queen's quiet refuges was about to change hands. By the time the purchase was finalized early in the new year, the process had unfolded almost entirely outside the awareness of the royal household. The first official record of the transaction appeared only when the property registry updated its ownership details, which was why the discovery felt so jarring. It was not simply the outcome that shocked palace officials. It was the realization that the entire process had taken place without their knowledge. In legal terms, the Sussexes had done nothing improper. The estate had been eligible for private sale. Buyers had every right to pursue the property if they wished. The law surrounding such transactions was clear. But the royal family has always operated according to a second layer of expectations, a set of quiet understandings that exist beyond formal legality. Certain decisions, particularly those touching on family history, are usually discussed long before contracts are signed, not because they must be, but because tradition demands it. And in this case, that tradition had been bypassed completely. Within hours of the discovery, palace officials began asking the same question again and again. Has Harry informed anyone? Had there been a conversation, even an informal one, warning the family that he and Meghan were interested in the estate? So far, no one could find evidence of such a conversation, which led to an increasingly uncomfortable conclusion. Either Harry had deliberately kept the negotiations private, or he had assumed the purchase would not matter. Neither explanation eased the tension building within the palace. Because to many inside the royal household, the issue was no longer about property law. It was about something far more fragile: trust. Over the past several years, relations between the Sussex household and the rest of the royal family had already grown complicated, strained by public interviews, memoir revelations, and disagreements over the future role Harry and Meghan might play within the institution. Now, suddenly, the quiet purchase of the Queen's private estate seemed to reopen those wounds. What might have appeared to the outside world as a simple real estate transaction had, inside palace walls, taken on a very different meaning. It felt like another surprise, another decision delivered without warning. And as advisors across 3 royal residences began to grasp the full story of how the deal had unfolded, a new question began to surface beneath the growing tension. If Harry had been willing to move this quickly, and this quietly, what else might the family learn only after the fact? For the moment, however, the answer mattered less than the immediate reality. The deal was done, the contracts were signed, and the estate that once belonged to the Queen's private world was no longer beyond the reach of royal controversy. William's reaction behind closed doors. The briefing reached Prince William shortly after 8 in the morning. By then, the early confusion inside the palace had begun to solidify into something heavier, a quiet sense that a line had been crossed, though no one yet knew exactly how the family would respond. William sat at the desk in his Kensington Palace office, the thin property file still open in front of him. Outside the tall windows, the winter light had fully arrived, spreading across the gardens in a pale wash of gold. Inside the room, however, the mood remained subdued. His private secretary stood nearby, waiting. William had already read through the ownership documents twice. The legal language was straightforward. There was no ambiguity in the details. The estate had been purchased, and the names attached to the title left no room for misinterpretation. Prince Harry, Meghan Markle. For a long moment, William did not speak. His eyes remained fixed on the final page of the report, where the transfer date confirmed that the sale had been completed weeks earlier, long before anyone inside the palace had realized the property was even available. Finally, he leaned back slightly in his chair. "When did this listing first appear?" he asked. His secretary explained what the advisors at Buckingham Palace had already pieced together. The estate had entered the private market quietly during the autumn, circulated through a brokerage network known for discreet historic properties. William listened carefully, his expression measured. There was no visible anger, but there was something else, a tightening seriousness that those who worked closely with him had learned to recognize. Because the issue, from William's perspective, extended beyond the transaction itself. The estate was not just land, it was tied to the memory of the Queen. And within the royal family, certain places carried emotional weight that could not be separated from their ownership. William knew the property well enough to understand that. He remembered visiting it during childhood trips, when the atmosphere around the Queen had always seemed just slightly lighter, less burdened by the rigid choreography of royal duty. To see it now attached to Harry's name, after years of public tension between the Sussex household and the monarchy, felt complicated in ways that were difficult to articulate. William closed the folder slowly. "What else do we know?" he asked. The secretary admitted that the palace was still gathering details. For the moment, there was only the basic outline of the transaction and a growing awareness that the family had been taken by surprise. William nodded once. Outside the office, the palace corridors were already alive, with quiet conversations as advisors compared notes and tried to understand how the situation had unfolded. Inside the room, however, William remained still for several seconds longer, because beneath the legal documents and property records lay a deeper concern. The fragile boundary between family and institution had already been tested many times in recent years, and now, with one unexpected purchase, that boundary seemed to have shifted again. The family confrontation. By mid-afternoon, the conversations that had begun as quiet administrative briefings had moved into a more sensitive territory. What had started as confusion was now something closer to a family matter. Inside Buckingham Palace, senior advisors had begun preparing a summary of the situation for the king. The document was carefully worded, outlining the legal facts of the estate's sale, the timeline of the transaction, and the unexpected discovery that the property now belonged to the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. But beneath the calm language of the briefing sat an unmistakable tension, because for many within the royal family, the estate had never been just another property. It had been part of the Queen's private world. By early evening, a series of quiet consultations had begun between senior members of the family. These were not formal meetings with agendas or official minutes. Instead, they were the kind of conversations that unfold behind closed doors when a situation touches both personal relationships and institutional symbolism. King Charles listened as advisors explained the circumstances of the purchase. There was no immediate display of anger. Instead, the king asked careful questions about the legal structure of the sale. Had the estate been offered widely? Who had authorized the listing? And most importantly, had anyone within the royal household been informed before the transaction was finalized? The answers were not reassuring. As the conversation continued, another issue began to surface, one that was less about law and more about precedent. If a property so closely associated with the Queen's personal life could quietly pass into private ownership without the knowledge of the royal household, what did that mean for the broader stewardship of family history? For Prince William, the question carried a more emotional dimension. The estate represented something deeply connected to his grandmother's memory, and the idea that it had been acquired without even a conversation beforehand felt unsettling. Yet even as frustrations simmered within these discussions, there was also a clear awareness of the delicate balance the family now faced. Publicly confronting Harry and Meghan over the purchase could easily inflame an already fragile relationship. Remaining silent, however, risked allowing the moment to pass without acknowledgement. For now, the royal family found itself in a familiar position, navigating the complicated space where private family dynamics and the public symbolism of the monarchy intersect. And once again, the choices ahead promised to be anything but simple. A new chapter in the royal rift. In the days that followed, the palace returned outwardly to its familiar rhythm. Public engagements continued. Official statements focused on charity initiatives and diplomatic meetings. Royal schedules moved forward with the careful choreography that has long defined the institution. Yet beneath that surface calm, the discovery of the estate's new ownership lingered quietly in the background. Inside palace offices, advisors were still tracing the path that had allowed the property to change hands without the family's awareness. Property specialists reviewed old documents. Legal teams examined the estate's ownership history. Administrative staff tried to determine whether any earlier signals of the sale had been missed. But the more they studied the timeline, the clearer the situation became. Nothing had technically gone wrong. The estate had been eligible for private sale. The brokerage firm had operated within normal legal boundaries. Harry and Meghan's representatives had simply moved quickly, faster than anyone inside the royal household had expected. And now, the consequences of that speed were unfolding in ways that extended far beyond the original transaction. Because the estate was no longer just a quiet countryside retreat, it had become a symbol. Among royal watchers, whispers of the purchase had begun circulating in small circles of journalists and commentators. The story had not yet reached full public visibility, but those who followed the royal family closely could sense that something unusual had happened behind palace walls. Questions began to emerge. Why had the estate been sold? Why had the royal household not intervened? And perhaps most intriguingly, why had Harry and Meghan chosen that particular property? Within the Sussex household, however, the purchase likely carried a different meaning. For Harry, the estate may have represented a personal connection to the grandmother he had often described with deep affection. In recent years, he had spoken openly about the emotional weight of losing her, about the quiet support she had sometimes offered during the most turbulent moments of his life. Owning a place tied to her private world may have felt, to him, like a way of preserving that connection. Yet, intentions rarely travel unchanged once they enter the complex landscape of royal family dynamics. Inside the palace, the symbolism of the estate's transfer had already taken on a different interpretation. To some advisors, the purchase appeared to reinforce a pattern that had developed over the past several years. A pattern in which Harry and Meghan continued to operate independently of the institution, while still moving within its emotional and historical orbit. They were no longer working royals, yet their decisions continued to intersect with the monarchy's legacy, and that intersection was rarely simple. For Prince William, the estate's new ownership created a quiet but unmistakable shift in the family's internal landscape. The property was now connected to the Sussex household in a permanent way, tying a piece of the Queen's personal history to a branch of the family that had increasingly moved outside the traditional framework of royal life. It was not a crisis. No constitutional rule had been broken. But symbols mattered deeply inside a monarchy, built on tradition and continuity. And this particular symbol would not disappear easily. Even if the story faded from headlines, the estate itself would remain. Its gates, its fields, its quiet rooms, now belonging to a different chapter of the family's evolving narrative. For King Charles, the moment represented another reminder of how delicate the balance between personal relationships and institutional stewardship had become. The monarchy has always required its members to navigate both roles simultaneously, father and son, brother and brother, king and institution. When those roles align, the system moves forward smoothly. When they begin to diverge, the strain becomes visible. The purchase of the Queen's former private estate had not created the rift within the royal family. That divide had been forming for years. But in its quiet way, the transaction illuminated the distance that now existed between two different visions of royal life, one rooted in tradition, duty, and carefully managed continuity, the other shaped by independence, personal choice, and a life lived largely beyond palace walls. And somewhere in the middle of those two worlds stood the estate itself, a peaceful countryside refuge that had once offered the Queen a place of quiet reflection. Now it had become something else entirely. A reminder that even the most private corners of royal history can eventually find themselves pulled into the ongoing story of the House of Windsor.